The day dawned gray and cold over the walls of Winterfell, the sky draped with low, heavy clouds like a wolf's pelt. Arya Stark stood in the courtyard, listening to the wind roar beyond the ramparts. The North was in her blood, in every breath she took, and it felt fitting that the ceremony taking place on this day was accompanied by no bright sunlight, no fanfare of warm breezes. Instead, the swirling gusts carried the sense of pine and earth, and the hush that lay over the keep seemed to magnify the significance of what was about to happen. She found herself so keenly aware of every sound, the clink of metal from the smithy, the faint murmur of distant conversation from the great hall, the steady drip of melting snow from the eaves, that she could have sworn the entire world was poised on the edge of a knife, holding its breath. She brushed an errant strand of dark hair from her face. Though she normally kept it cropped short for convenience, it had grown just enough during the last moon cycle to be a nuisance, forever sliding into her vision. Her cloak was thick, wolf-gray, emblazoned with the dire wolf sigil at its fastening. The cloak was brand new, a gift from her sister Sansa, who had quietly taken the helm of ensuring that the day's events would run smoothly. The sense of tradition clung to Arya now, heavier even than the thick wool around her shoulders. So much had changed in the last years, long journeys by land and sea, countless perils, the heartbreak of wars lost and partially won. And yet, through it all, the North had endured. She had endured. And soon, she would be bound in marriage to Gendry Baratheon, forging a new link that would join House Stark and House Baratheon in a way no one had predicted. She remembered how it all began. Once, Gendry was just a boy with a hammer, a bastard of Robert Baratheon, nothing more than a traveling companion she'd stumbled upon when she was younger and on the run. She had liked his straightforward nature, the spark of kindness in his deep blue eyes, and the way his arms bore the strength of a skilled blacksmith. She liked that he never looked down on her or treated her delicately. The memory of their early days, scraping by on the roads, hiding from the Lannisters, talking in hushed voices by the dim glow of campfires, these recollections warmed her more than any hearth could. She tried not to think of the heartbreak or the countless tragedies that had torn the realm apart, and instead recalled his smile when he teased her, the genuineness behind his sly humor. He was older now as she was, and the trials of war had carved their lines into his face. There was something about him, always honest, sometimes brash, but so comforting to be around. The first time she saw him after everything, she nearly ran to him without thinking. That was on the day the lords of the Stormlands and the North convened to talk of alliances. She had come as Sansa's envoy, a new role for her, who had never cared for courtesies and politics. But politics, as she would soon learn, were tangled in the fates of noble houses. Gendry, with his newly legitimized name, had found himself suddenly the Lord of Storm's End after the war. He had looked awkward among those lords initially, a blacksmith promoted to nobility, uncertain of the proper courtesies. But his heart had not changed, nor had the warmth in his eyes when he saw her. It was Sansa who first recognized the potential match, though Arya and Gendry themselves were barely aware of their own feelings, or perhaps too stubborn to acknowledge them. A union between House Stark and House Baratheon would seal a strong alliance for the North and the Stormlands alike. Yet none of these calculations occurred to Arya as she found herself stolen away by Gendry's grin, by the earnestness in his voice when he spoke to her. He was just Gendry. He made her laugh in a way no one else did, and she could see in his face that he understood her truly. Not many had done so in her life. Most people saw only the Stark name, the sword in her hand, or the scars on her heart. But Gendry saw Arya. She inhaled, closing her eyes a moment. The memory of Ned Stark, her father, rose unbidden in her mind. She wished he could be there, to see the union of Stark and Baratheon become something other than the disastrous entanglement that had sparked a rebellion and the downfall of the Targaryens so many years back. If he were alive, would he give his blessing to this match? Part of her believed he would. If only he could see how Gendry had proven himself time and time again to be a man of honor. Clumsy in noble courts, perhaps, but loyal and brave. Another part of her recalled the fights, the chaos, the bloodshed that the Baratheon name had invited upon Westeros. But she had chosen to push those thoughts away. Nothing in this world was ever simple. She heard footsteps approaching across the courtyard's flagstones. Sansa arrived with a small retinue of Winterfell steward and a pair of guards. Her hair, now grown long again, was woven into a loose braid that spilled over her shoulders, and the cloak on her shoulders was a regal white that shimmered faintly with an intricate pattern of weirwood leaves embroidered at its edge. There was a gentle, confident air about her, a far cry from the frightened girl who had once dreamed of golden-haired princes and the gaiety of King's Landing's tournaments. Now, Sansa's eyes gleamed with a quiet determination, and she held her head high, very inch the Lady of Winterfell. "Arya," Sansa said softly, stepping close, "I came to see if you needed anything before we begin. Are you well?" "Just restless," Arya admitted. She forced a small smile. "I'm not used to all this pomp. I prefer to keep moving." Sansa returned the smile, albeit with a bit of sisterly exasperation. "I know, but this is an important day." The lords and ladies have begun to gather in the Great Hall. "You'll have to make an entrance soon." Arya's eyes flickered toward the main keep. She could already envision the watchful eyes, the curious whispers. Her wedding would not be a grand affair like the royal weddings of King's Landing, but it would be the forging of a bond between two major houses, and that was enough to draw attention. "I don't care about impressing them," she said, her voice barely loud enough to carry beyond Sansa's hearing. "You don't have to impress them," Sansa reassured her, "only let them witness the union. Be yourself, Arya. You've never been anyone else." Arya nodded. A small swirl of doubt gnawed at her, wondering how Gendry felt about all this formality. She guessed he was equally ill at ease but determined to do right by this arrangement, by her. She hoped he wasn't locked away practicing courtesies in a mirror. The thought almost made her chuckle aloud. Sansa leaned in and kissed Arya gently on the cheek, a gesture that managed to be both sisterly and regal. "I'll see you inside," she said, before turning away to move back inside the keep, the guards falling into step behind her. The courtyard felt emptier once Sansa was gone. Arya took a moment to still her breath, letting the chill settle into her bones until she felt more awake, more acutely present. Beneath everything, she felt a faint flutter of nerves in her stomach. It was not fear, no, she had felt fear on the roads as a child, with enemies close at hand and no one she could trust. This was excitement, anticipation, and the faint sense of stepping into a new life. How strange, she thought, that of all the things she had believed she might do, marrying Gendry had never occurred to her back then. Fate was an unpredictable seamstress, weaving threads no one could have predicted. She glanced up at the sky. The clouds remained thick, but a small break allowed a pale shaft of light to slip through. For just an instant, it caught on the rim of a distant tower, illuminating the stone in a haze of silver. A good omen, Arya told herself, or at least not a bad one. Then she spun on her heel and marched toward the keep, determined not to let any more anxious thoughts linger. If she was to stand in front of lords and ladies, she would do so with her chin high, as befitting a Stark of Winterfell. Inside, the corridors seemed warmer than usual, the torches freshly lit. Voices rose from deeper within, a gathering of well-dressed men and women, the shuffling of boots on stone, the polite laughter that accompanied noble gatherings. Arya had grown accustomed to ignoring such chatter, but today was different. Every word seemed to revolve around her wedding, her name, her house. She pressed her lips together and tried not to scowl as she walked. A pair of serving girls rushed past carrying trays of fresh bread and roasted meats. The smells were enticing: venison, winter spices, bread still steaming from the oven. She paused near one of the side doors, feeling the faint swirl of colder air from a crack in the stone. She thought of making one last escape, just for a minute, to run outside or down the winding corridors to the crypts, to lose herself among ancient memories. But that impulse receded quickly. She was not running anymore. Not today. Bracing herself, she made her way to the Great Hall's entrance, where two guards in stark livery awaited. When they recognized her, they nodded and opened the heavy wooden doors. The hall beyond was brightly lit by torches and the great fire roaring at its far end, the place abuzz with color and conversation. Lords from various corners of the north, their cloaks lined with fur, mingled with the Stormlanders who had accompanied Gendry. The latter wore clothing more suited to the temperate lands near the sea, often with the stag of Baratheon embroidered on their chests. Though she recognized few by name, she could tell which were from the north and which from the Stormlands by their stances. Northerners bore a kind of stoic solidity, while the Stormlanders carried themselves with a briny swagger, shaped by sea winds and heavier rains. But amid all that, the hush that descended when Arya entered was immediate. She had never been one for ceremonious entrances, but as the crowd parted for her, she felt a distant memory stir. The day her sister Sansa had walked into a feast, the moment their father had introduced them all to the lords. This felt the same, yet it was entirely new. She forced a small smile, her heart thumping faster than she liked. She could see the faces. Some awed, some pleased, some merely curious. There were men in their finest doublets, women in gowns of plush velvet, a scattering of cloaks in green, gold, gray, and crimson. At the far end of the hall stood Sansa and Bran, the latter seated in his wheeled chair, gazing at her with his knowing eyes. And next to them was Gendry Baratheon, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in a new tunic of dark blue with the crowned stag of his house embroidered in silver thread. A heavy cloak of black fur draped his back, pinned with a simple iron clasp shaped like a hammer, an homage to his humble origins. He looked handsome, Arya realized with a start. Not in the polished sense that so many knights aimed for, but in his honest, open manner. The set of his jaw was firm but not harsh, and his hair, thick and dark, curled just slightly at the ends. His gaze locked onto hers the moment she entered, and an unmistakable expression of admiration broke across his features. Around him, a hush fell again, as the wedding ceremony was about to begin. The officiant for the ceremony was the Maester of Winterfell, a gray-haired man with kind eyes. He stepped forward, clearing his throat, and began to speak in a tone designed to carry across the hall. We gather today under the watchful gaze of the old gods and the Seven in the presence of the Lady of Winterfell and of our honored guests to witness the union of Arya Stark of Winterfell and Gendry Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End. His words echoed in the hall, solemn yet reverent. Arya approached slowly, as tradition demanded, each step seeming louder than it should. Gendry inclined his head slightly in greeting, and she saw the faintest quirk of his lips that he only half succeeded in hiding. The Maester continued, his voice rising and falling in the formal cadences that bound houses together. This is a union not only of two individuals, but of two noble houses that share a storied past. By this bond may the friendship between the North and the Stormlands be strengthened, and may peace and prosperity follow in its wake. Sansa moved forward to stand at Arya's side, the quiet rustle of her skirts the only sound besides the Maester's words. Gendry was joined by one of his bannermen, a middle-aged knight in a practical blue cloak. They stood facing one another, Gendry and Arya, and she noticed how his cheeks bore the faint stain of nerves, just as hers probably did. The hall was so quiet that Arya could have sworn she heard the crackle of the logs in the far hearth, the collective beating of hearts. Do you, Arya Stark, swear by the old gods and the new that you take Gendry Baratheon as your husband, to honor him and stand by his side, to uphold the bond between your house and his, and to guide your family with loyalty and love? Arya's heart pounded, but she spoke clearly, letting her voice carry, calm and sure. I do swear it. And do you, Gendry Baratheon, swear by the old gods and the new that you take Arya Stark as your wife, to honor her and stand by her side, to uphold the bond between your house and hers, and to guide your family with loyalty and love? Gendry's voice, though not as booming as Robert Baratheon's once was said to be, carried a strength that filled the silence. I swear it, he said, meeting her gaze with steadfast sincerity. The Maester produced a length of ribbon, dyed a deep gray blue, signifying the union of Stark gray and Baratheon blue. He wrapped it gently around their joined hands. Arya felt the smooth material press against her skin, binding her hand to Gendry's. Despite the crowd, her entire consciousness seemed focused on that moment. She felt the warmth of Gendry's palm, the steadiness of his grip, and remembered all the hardships they had faced. She as a wandering child of a noble house in hiding, he as a bastard blacksmith with no home, both separated by fate and war. It felt surreal to stand here now, about to share a life together that neither had foreseen. In the sight of gods and men, the Maester intoned, I bind your hands, your hearts, and your houses. Let all here bear witness to the creation of this new bond. He paused, then gently unwrapped the ribbon and presented it for the two newlyweds to see. May you wear it or keep it as a symbol of your union. Let nothing break the tie that has been woven here today. A ripple of applause and hushed voices spread through the hall. Gendry squeezed Arya's hand for a fleeting moment, and she found herself unable to repress the quick grin that lit up her face. She heard a few scattered cheers, likely from the Stormlanders who were less inhibited about showing emotion during such ceremonies. The Northerners, for their part, nodded and clapped politely, showing the subdued acceptance that came with a carefully negotiated alliance. They turned to face the room as the new Lord and Lady Baratheon, or so the formalities would have it. But Arya felt no immediate transformation. She was still Arya Stark, though with a ring of hammered silver on her finger and a promise sworn in front of the entire realm. She glanced at Gendry. He looked relieved, proud, and perhaps still somewhat bashful. She squeezed his hand in return and allowed Sansa to usher them to the high table, where the celebratory feast would begin in earnest. Servants bustled about, pouring ale and wine into cups, arranging platters of roasted game and stewed vegetables. The great hall seemed ablaze with torchlight, dancing across the polished wood of the tables. From her seat, Arya could see that even the surly lords who rarely smiled were loosening up, sipping from their cups and exchanging pleasantries. As Gendry took his place beside her, she noticed the tension in his shoulders begin to melt away. He leaned over to whisper in her ear, a subtle grin tugging at his mouth. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" Arya snorted softly. "I've been in fights less tense than this." He laughed, the sound of it bright even over the hum of the gathering. "It'll get easier, and tomorrow, I promise, no more fancy speeches. Just you and me, maybe a chance for a real talk. And I'll show you how good I've become with a forge. There's one in Winterfell, but I hear it's not used as much these days." Arya's smile lingered. "I'd like that." For a moment, she let the noise recede into the background, focusing on the man beside her. The memory of that moment by the campfire when he first teased her about being highborn flickered in her mind. How far they had come. Sansa caught her eye from across the table and lifted her cup in a graceful gesture of congratulations. Arya returned the toast, feeling a wave of gratitude toward her sister. They had both been shaped by heartbreak, by battles both within and without. That they stood here now, reunited, was a testament to their resilience. A hush fell again as Sansa stood, signaling she was about to speak. "My lords and ladies," she began, her voice clear and poised, "it is my greatest joy to welcome Gendry Baratheon into the Stark family. May the union of our houses stand as a sign that the wounds of war can heal and new bonds can be forged. Let us raise a cup to the bride and groom." The crowd echoed with the scraping of chairs and the murmur of agreement as cups were raised. Arya felt her cheeks warm as all eyes turned to her and Gendry once more. He raised his own cup, the muscles in his arm rippling beneath his tunic, and she lifted hers, tipping it slightly against his. She tasted the northern ale on her tongue, strong and bitter, a flavor that reminded her of home. Between courses, various nobles rose to offer gifts, each with a brief word or two of well-wishing. An old northern lord, grizzled and battle-worn, presented them with a pair of finely wrought daggers, their hilts shaped like snarling dire wolves. A Stormlander lord, tall and broad as a bull, offered them a cask of rare spiced wine said to be from the southernmost coasts. The entire time, Arya tried to maintain a polite expression, something she'd never been adept at, while Gendry thanked them in that quiet, straightforward manner of his. She appreciated his sincerity. He did not flourish his words or feign elaborate courtesies. He simply said thank you in a way that conveyed genuine gratitude, and people seemed to respect that. The hours drifted past amid feasting, toasting, and the occasional burst of laughter. Arya noted how the Stormlanders ate heartily, cracking jokes and voices that carried across the table. The Northerners were quieter, though no less robust in their appreciation of good food and drink. In time, the tension that always accompanied alliances settled into an easier camaraderie, as though both sides realized that the days of open conflict were behind them, at least for now. At one point, Gendry excused himself to speak with a small group of his men. Arya took the opportunity to slip away from the table and wander the edges of the hall. She felt a keen need to breathe, to find a moment of calm in the swirl of celebration. She paused near one of the tall windows, where the night sky outside was darker than black velvet, a few stars barely visible through the drifting clouds. She hadn't stood there long before a soft step behind her announced someone's approach. Turning, she found that it was Sansa again. Her sister came to stand at her side, looking out into the night. "You're not overly fond of gatherings like this, are you?" Sansa said gently. Arya shrugged, a small, wry smile curling her lips. "I've learned to bear them. They're part of our world, for better or worse." Sansa's gaze flicked over Arya's shoulder, likely checking to see if anyone was close enough to overhear. Satisfied they were relatively alone, she spoke in a more intimate tone. "I wanted to make sure you're all right. This day is momentous. I remember how nervous I was at my first betrothal feast. Arya felt the old pang in her chest at the memory of Sansa's arranged engagements, the pain and heartbreak that had plagued her journey. "I'm all right," Arya said softly. "Truly, Sansa. It's different for me. I know Gendry and he knows me. This isn't like the fancy illusions you used to dream about." Sansa's smile was tinged with wistfulness. "I dreamed of princes and songs, but now I see that sometimes a marriage can be something simpler, more genuine. It warms my heart to see you with someone who respects your spirit. And the alliance is a boon to us all, but I can see that your reasons are more personal than political." "They are," Arya agreed. She breathed in, letting the tension drain from her limbs. "And I suppose that's the one thing I've always wanted, to be seen as who I am, not just a daughter of House Stark." Sansa reached out, placing a hand over Arya's. "I'm happy for you, little sister. Whatever the future brings, know that you have your family's love." For a moment, the sisters stood there in silence, the noise of the feast a soft roar in the background. Then Sansa stepped away, noticing that a noble from the Manderley family was approaching, likely seeking to offer some courtesy or request. Arya let Sansa handle it, slipping back through the crowd until she found Gendry once more. He stood conversing with a handful of men who wore the sigil of the stag on their cloaks, and as she approached, he turned toward her with a grin that made her heart skip a beat. He excused himself and held out a hand for Arya, who took it without hesitation. "I was just asking my men to keep the castle smithy in order," he said in a low voice meant for her ears alone. "I can't stand the thought of letting a good forge go unused." "Good," Arya replied. "We'll have to see if you've still got your skill. I recall you used to be quite handy with a hammer." His brow arched, a playful light in his eyes. "Better than I was, I think. And what about you and your needle? Still practicing, I hope?" A faint laugh escaped her. "Every day. Maybe we can have a proper spar one of these nights, show these lords and ladies that a blacksmith and a wolf girl can dance better than any knight and lady." He chuckled, and for a moment they were just two souls who had fought through countless perils to find themselves here. The music that began to fill the hall was a lilting tune, the notes soaring like starlings above the hum of voices. Gendry inclined his head toward the small clearing where some couples were tentatively beginning to dance. Arya felt her stomach clench. Dancing had never been her favorite pastime. But the warmth in Gendry's eyes encouraged her. "Shall we?" he asked. Arya hesitated, memories of her dancing lessons in King's Landing swirling in her mind, Syrio Farrell calling her boy and girl by turns, teaching her the water dance. She had never learned the formal courtly dances, but part of her wanted to accept the moment for what it was. "All right," she said, and allowed him to lead her to the open space near the long tables. They were not the most graceful couple on the floor. Sansa, had she chosen to dance, would have outshone them without effort. But there was something tender in the way Gendry placed a careful hand at her waist, the other holding hers softly. Arya did her best to follow the steps, but more often than not, she resorted to half-laughing as she stumbled. He was not much better, occasionally stepping on her toes or catching the edge of her cloak with his boot. Yet they found a clumsy rhythm of their own, moving in slow circles that made them smile rather than impress. Around them, others danced with practiced motions, but Arya and Gendry were lost in each other, sharing a moment that was wholly theirs. The flickering torchlight bathed them in a golden glow, and for the first time that night, Arya felt the swirl of happiness overtake her entirely. The feast wore on, and eventually, as the hour grew late, the guests began to drift away to their chambers, to the warmth of the hearths in their assigned rooms throughout Winterfell's many towers. A few of the hardier or more inebriated lords lingered, telling rowdy stories and draining the last of the ale casks. Arya walked through the residual gatherings of people hand in hand with Gendry, feeling a gentle exhaustion in her limbs. Despite the rowdiness of a select few, the majority of the keep had settled into a softer murmur of activity. The music still played, albeit more quietly. She glimpsed Sansa in whispered conversation with Maester Wolkan, their expressions serious, likely discussing the next day's itinerary for the visiting lords. Arya doubted the celebration would end abruptly. It would probably taper off into smaller gatherings and private toasts. But she and Gendry had done their part, and now the day was winding down. She led him through a side corridor, away from the prying eyes of those who might follow them. The corridor's stone walls were cool and rough beneath the tapestries that adorned them. Gendry walked slowly at her side, his earlier discomfort with formalities replaced by a thoughtful quiet. Eventually, they reached a small gallery that overlooked the courtyard. Arya pushed open a heavy wooden door and stepped onto a balcony. The night air rushed over them, frigid against the warmth of their cloaks. Below, the courtyard was mostly empty, save for a couple of guards making their rounds, lantern light bobbing in the darkness. The sky had cleared just enough for a slice of moonlight to paint the ramparts in silver. Arya leaned against the balustrade, taking in the chill, the silence. Gendry joined her, resting his broad hands on the cold stone. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hush was comfortable, like a shared secret. After a time, he turned to her, his voice low and tinged with a strange blend of awe and tenderness. "Never thought I'd stand here like this," he said. "With you, married of all things." Arya gave a soft snort. "I never thought I'd marry anyone," she admitted. "So many times. I was sure I'd die before I wore a wedding cloak. The roads I traveled were dangerous, and I was hunted." She paused, teeth grazing her lower lip. "I suppose I always carried Winterfell with me, though, even when I was halfway across the world. And now I'm here, and you're here. Strange how the world turns," Gendry said, his expression warm. He lifted a hand to brush a strand of hair from her cheek. The calluses on his fingers reminded her of the sword's hilt, the blacksmith's hammer, the real grit of survival. It was a gesture that felt both intimate and deeply comforting. If someone had told me back then, when we were on the road with that lot of recruits and rogues, that I'd be Lord of Storm's End, and that I'd have the hand of Arya Stark, I'd have thought them mad. She laughed, the sound quiet in the open air. I might have agreed, but here we are. Are you frightened at all, Gendry? Of what might come next? He pondered for a moment, his brow furrowing. Not frightened, more uneasy maybe. I know forging steel, I know how to handle myself in a fight. But leading men, hosting bannermen, dealing with the politics, those things still make me feel like I'm wearing clothes that don't quite fit. He paused, then added with a small chuckle. Though I suppose you're no more at ease with the idea of presiding over Storm's End, receiving lords and ladies and all that. Arya shook her head with a rueful grin. I've never been much for the pomp, but I'll manage it if I have to. We'll figure it out together. If the Stormlords want a fancy lady, they won't find one in me. But if they want someone who can hold a sword and protect her own, well, that I can do. Gendry's smile deepened, his eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. Then we're well matched. She placed a hand over his. Let them talk if they want. We know who we are. He turned his hand beneath hers so that their fingers twined together, and for a moment, Arya felt a stillness within herself she hadn't known in years. The sense of always being on guard, always ready to flee or fight, began to ease. She was still Arya, the wolf blood running in her veins, but now she had someone she could stand beside without fear or apology. It was a rare gift, and she felt an unexpected spark of gratitude. They lingered on the balcony for a while longer, exchanging a few quiet words, letting the night wind carry away the noise of the feast. At length, they decided to return indoors, if only to avoid catching a chill. The corridors now were largely empty, most of the guests having retreated to their chambers or still reveling in the main hall. When they reached Arya's chamber, now it would be their shared chambers if they wished, Gendry paused at the threshold. Nervous energy pulsed between them, an acknowledgement that their marriage was more than a name on parchment. It was a bond of lives, hearts, and bodies. But Arya, being who she was, simply pushed the door open and stepped inside, letting the firelight from the hearth reveal a room warmed by fresh logs. She waited until Gendry joined her, then closed the door gently behind them. Inside, a simple arrangement of chairs and a table stood near the hearth. Arya removed her cloak and draped it over the back of a chair. Gendry did the same with a moment of hesitation, as though he were trying not to fumble. She offered him a reassuring look. The silence between them was charged, but not uncomfortable. She remembered a night, so long ago, when the two of them had huddled beneath the meager cover of trees, cold and afraid. This was different. They were safe here, in Winterfell, with a bright fire crackling. They were not children anymore. He broke the silence first, his voice husky. I don't know the right words for this, he admitted, stepping closer. But I want to do right by you, Arya. She heard the unspoken meaning, the swirl of emotions that came with consummating a marriage. She wasn't sure what to say either. Words were never her strongest suit, especially about matters like this. So she did the only thing that felt natural. She reached out, took hold of his collar, and pulled him gently toward her, pressing her lips to his. The moment their lips met, she felt a jolt, a warmth that spread through her like the beginnings of a fierce blaze. She felt the roughness of his jawline, the solid strength of his chest beneath her hands, and a swirl of memories rose, glimpses of the boy with the bull's helm, the blacksmith working in the heat of the forge, the unkempt, determined companion on a perilous journey. Now he was her husband, and she realized how much she wanted this closeness. She wanted to embrace him without fear or regret, to let him see the parts of her she kept hidden from the world. For a moment, they were unsteady, as though stepping into unfamiliar territory. But soon, that awkwardness gave way to a simpler, purer yearning. They kissed again, more slowly this time, drinking in the warmth that bound them. Arya felt his arm slide around her waist, his other hand lifting to rest lightly at the back of her head. She let her own hands explore the breadth of his shoulders, the line of his neck, the softness of his hair. When they broke apart, both were breathing a bit faster, gazes locked. Gendry's eyes were wide, a flicker of amazement there, as though he, too, was discovering something new. The corners of Arya's mouth lifted in a small, mischievous grin. "Not bad, Lord Baratheon," she murmured, teasing him gently. He let out a breathy chuckle. "I can only improve with practice," he said, a hint of that boyishness lingering. She drew back slightly, still within his arms. They had all the time in the world, or at least it felt that way in this moment. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new challenges. For tonight, they were husband and wife, and that notion still felt strange in her mind, but not unwelcome. They moved toward the bed, though the night was theirs to shape as they pleased. The heavy curtains at the window were drawn, shutting out the moonlight, leaving only the warm glow of the hearth to paint dancing shadows across the walls. Gendry sat down on the edge of the bed, and she stood before him, studying his face. He raised a hand, gently tracing the line of her jaw as if memorizing every contour. Her heart pounded, but she felt no hesitation now. Leaning down, she kissed him once more, letting the sweetness of it linger, letting the flame they shared kindle into something bright and certain. In the hush of the northern night, they forged a bond that was wholly their own. When at last they lay quietly, the fire nearly burned to embers, Arya felt Gendry's hand wrapped around hers, fingers interlaced. The warmth of his body next to hers made the cold beyond the walls feel distant, like a bad dream from which she had finally awakened. She stared at the low-burning flames in the hearth, exhaustion creeping over her. "Sleep," Gendry murmured, voice half-drowsy. "We've a busy day tomorrow, or so the lords will insist." She smirked faintly, pressing closer to his side. "Let them wait," she whispered, a faint rebellious edge to her tone. But as her eyes slid shut, she realized she was content to let the world spin while she rested. For once, she did not feel the need to look over her shoulder or keep a blade beneath her pillow. The quiet assurance of Gendry's presence was a lullaby she never expected to find. Thus ended the day of Arya Stark's marriage to Gendry Baratheon, quiet, clumsy, heartfelt, and binding. In a realm so scarred by war, by broken vows and bitter feuds, perhaps this new union might stand for something fresh. But that would be the challenge of tomorrow, for in Westeros, peace could be as fleeting as a breath on a cold morning. They woke to a dim gray light filtering through the window's heavy drapes, a pale echo of dawn that signaled a new day for House Stark and House Baratheon alike. The fire in the hearth had smoldered down to ash and half-burned logs, and the chill of the north seeped through the stones, but the warmth beneath the furs remained. For a moment, Arya lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of someone else's arm draped over her. Then she remembered the wedding, the promises made before the old gods and the new, and the quiet certainty that came after. Gendry stirred against her, blinking in the gloom. His eyes found hers, and a brief, sleepy grin shaped his mouth. Arya felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. She had faced enemies across battlefields and in dark alleys, yet this moment of closeness was its own sort of challenge. She slid out from under the covers, shivering as her feet met the cold floor. Without a word, she crossed to the window and pulled the drapes apart. Light flooded in, tinted faintly silver by a sky still bearing the aftertaste of night. She looked over her shoulder at Gendry, who was sitting up, the furs pulled around his waist, hair tousled. He seemed to be regarding her with an equal mixture of wonder and uncertainty. She remembered how many times they had sat by a campfire in their youth, half-starved, shivering, always alert for the slightest threat. Now they were here, husband and wife, in Winterfell's snug chambers. He cleared his throat. "Morning," he said, voice slightly raspy. Arya found herself smirking. "Morning," she echoed, letting the syllable hang in the air. She turned to the window again, opening the latch. The crisp northern breeze gusted in, raising goose flesh on her arms. "Ready to face the lords and ladies?" A quiet groan passed his lips as he ran a hand through his dark hair. "I might be, but I suspect they'll have a full day planned for us. Feasts, good wishes, talk of alliances, suggestions on how we ought to proceed." Arya closed the window. We'll survive, she said, crossing back toward the bed. And soon all the ceremonies will be behind us. The real work is forging a life, yes? You in your forge, me with my sword, or maybe something else. Maybe I'll learn to make arrowheads or help you cast metal. She wasn't entirely joking. She felt drawn to the idea of a simpler life, even if they were both now bound by greater responsibilities. Gendry pushed himself up, rising to his feet. I'd like that, he admitted. It'd be good to do something with my hands that isn't just signing papers. Arya flung him a tunic from the folded garments on a nearby chest. Then let's get dressed, she suggested. We can slip into the hall, grab something to eat before the entire keep is awake. And maybe after we make an appearance, we can vanish for a few hours. I doubt Sansa would approve, but I never was very good at following all the rules. He couldn't help but laugh. No, I don't think you were, he said, and something in his tone suggested he found that trait endearing. He tugged the tunic over his head. It was a deep blue with a small stag sigil stitched at the hem. Likely something the household had prepared as part of the wedding. Arya slipped into her own clothes, favoring warm brown breeches, a linen undershirt, and a comfortable doublet in stark gray. When they stepped out into the corridor, the castle's hush told them the hour was still early. Their footsteps echoed off the walls as they made their way down a spiral staircase into the great hall. The lingering sense of last night's feast, roast venison, bread, spiced wine, clung to the air. A few servants were busy clearing away platters, scraping wax from candle holders, and resetting tables for the day's meals. One of them, a young girl with wide eyes, bobbed an awkward curtsy when she saw Gendry and Arya, addressing them as my lord and my lady. Gendry looked as though he was about to correct the girl, then remembered he was indeed now my lord. Arya only nodded, feeling no need to comment. They found the remnants of bread and cheese set aside, as well as a pitcher of small beer. Arya tore off a hunk of bread, motioning for Gendry to do the same. They ate in companionable silence, perched on a bench near the extinguished hearth, occasionally exchanging glances that were half amused, half thoughtful. The enormity of their new status hovered in the background, yet it did not smother them. They had always been able to find comfort in each other's presence, even when the world beyond was uncertain. Before long, footsteps echoed from the main doors. Arya looked up to see Sansa entering, already dressed in a long, softly colored gown that complemented her auburn hair. The Lady of Winterfell inclined her head in greeting, her gaze flicking between her sister and Gendry with a measured hint of warmth. You're both up early, she observed. I thought you might still be abed after yesterday's festivities. Arya shrugged. We wanted some quiet before the lords are upon us. Sansa offered a small nod. The Stormlanders have begun to stir. Some are in the courtyard, surveying Winterfell as if they've never seen so much snow and stone in one place. Others are already requesting an audience to speak of trade and future alliances. She paused, studying Gendry's face with the faintest hint of a smile. They're your men, Gendry. Or at least they will be if you manage them properly. He swallowed the last mouthful of bread. I suppose so, he said. I'll speak with them, though I might need advice on how best to proceed. I know how to lead a handful of smiths in a forge, but lords are another matter. Sansa's tone remained diplomatic. Take it one step at a time, she said. They want to be heard, to feel that their new lord values their counsel. Show them you care about the Stormlands, that your rule won't be half-hearted. And if you need to speak with me or with Maester Wolkin about policies or trade routes, we'll be here. In the meantime, we have a midday gathering planned in the Solar. I've arranged for a private meal with some of the Northern Bannermen and the Stormlander representatives who made the journey. Arya made a face. Sounds formal. It will be, Sansa allowed. But these gatherings are essential. Otherwise, we risk letting rumor outpace fact. Once they see you two together, truly united, perhaps the gossip will settle. Gendry stood, stretching his neck. Thank you, Sansa, he said. I appreciate all the arrangements. I know it can't be easy keeping so many lords content in Winterfell's walls. Her expression softened. It's what I do, she replied, in that graceful, level voice she had developed through years of hardship and growth. Then she turned to Arya. I trust you'll attend as well? Arya brushed crumbs from her hands. Wouldn't miss it, she said, though her tone was wry. At least we'll get a good meal out of it. Sansa took a measured breath as though she might say more, but then decided otherwise. She turned to leave. I'll expect you in the Solar by midday. Don't be late." The gentle admonition was more sisterly than commanding. When she was gone, Arya and Gendry exchanged a glance. "She's become quite good at that," Arya observed, meaning the artful dance of leadership. "She has," Gendry agreed, an edge of admiration in his voice. "So, what shall we do until midday?" Arya's eyes glinted with mischief. "Didn't you say you wanted to see the Winterfell forge? Let's go before anyone can summon us to discuss shipping routes or the duties of a lord." They left the great hall and made their way across the courtyard. The sun was climbing higher, though it remained pale, veiled by thin clouds. In the yard, a handful of Stormlander knights in dark cloaks were speaking in hushed tones. They briefly saluted Gendry when they saw him, but Arya didn't miss their curious stares. She could almost hear their unspoken thoughts. How strange that a daughter of Ned Stark, known for her skill with a blade and rumored to be anything but a proper lady, was now wed to the newly legitimized Baratheon lord. She pushed the thought aside, leading Gendry to a squat, unassuming building tucked near the northern wall. Inside, the smell of coal and iron smacked her in the face. A comforting smell that reminded her of the armory at King's Landing in the days when she'd been a too-curious child. Here, a handful of Winterfell smiths labored at the forge, shaping arrowheads, repairing bits of armor, the steady ring of metal on metal echoing. Gendry's eyes lit up at once. She saw him inhale deeply, as if breathing in an old friend. "Smell that?" he murmured. "Now this I know." One of the blacksmiths, a lean older man with a silver-threaded beard, recognized Arya and Gendry. He bowed his head in greeting. "My lord, my lady, come to see the workings." "May we?" Gendry asked, stepping forward. There was a touch of eagerness in his tone, like a boy eager to test a new hammer. "I won't disturb your work. Well, it's been a while since I saw a proper forge." The smith nodded respectfully. "You're welcome here any time, my lord. We've heard talk that you're a skilled hand yourself." Gendry moved closer to the anvil, studying the layout. The bellows, the arrangement of tongs, the waiting iron rods. Arya stood back, arms folded, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she saw him come alive. When the blacksmith offered him a hammer, Gendry took it almost reverently. Without preamble, he tested its weight, then placed a length of metal in the coals, pumping the bellows until the glow intensified. Arya watched, recalling the times she had seen him do this in the past. There was something steadying about the way he worked, each motion deliberate. She found herself momentarily mesmerized by the interplay of heat and metal, the clang of the hammer shaping the rod into something new. In a few minutes, the iron took on a rough shape, some manner of dagger or perhaps the beginnings of a spearhead. Gendry's expression was focused, sweat beading at his brow. By the time he set the hammer down, he was breathing quickly, but he looked content in a way that all the titles and formalities of lordship could never grant him. He handed the half-forged piece to the older smith, who nodded appreciatively. "A fine start," the man said. "Your technique's not wanting." Gendry grinned, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. "Guess I haven't forgotten everything." Arya shifted closer. "You looked happy," she said quietly. "I was," he admitted, voice still thick from exertion. "I've missed this." Then, glancing around, he added, "I'd like to see that the forge here is well supplied. Good iron, good steel, all of it. If I'm to be part of Winterfell for a time, I want to make sure the smithy's in order." The older smith offered a quick bow. "It would be an honor to learn from you, my lord. We do well enough, but improvements can always be made. And if you have new techniques from the Stormlands, or anything you've picked up along your travels, we'd be glad to know." Gendry nodded, though Arya could see the flicker of reminder that he, in fact, needed to become better acquainted with the Stormlands. He still carried the old habit of thinking of himself as a wandering blacksmith with no real home. Now he had two, Winterfell through Arya and Storm's End through royal decree. That duality shone in his eyes. "We'll talk more," he promised. "Thank you for letting me intrude." Arya and Gendry left the forge soon after, stepping back into the courtyard where the cold air bit at their flushed cheeks. She could see a cluster of courtiers and visiting lords near the main doors of the keep, no doubt expecting a word from Gendry about their next move. He glanced at her, and she offered an understanding shrug. "Duty calls," she said. He sighed. "Right? Let's get it over with." They joined the group, who greeted Gendry with a formal bow that still felt odd to Arya. She remembered him as a bastard boy who wore dirty clothes and hammered metal all day. Yet here, these southern knights treated him like a figure of authority. One, a short man with ruddy cheeks, introduced himself as Ser Howell, explaining that the Stormlanders wished to discuss the journey back to Storm's End and what Gendry intended to do once he assumed his seat there. "We've had word," Ser Howell said, "that Storm's End is in decent shape, though the steward has struggled to maintain certain defenses since Lord Renly's time. The coastline near Shipbreaker Bay still sees smugglers on occasion, and the harvest of the small folk in the surrounding hamlets is uncertain this season. We hope to hear your counsel and that of your new lady on how best to see the region restored to strength." Arya folded her arms, glancing at Gendry to let him answer. He looked thoughtful, swallowing once before speaking. "I'll want a proper assessment," he said. "Supplies, crops, livestock, everything. If the harvest is uncertain, we can arrange to bring in grain from elsewhere. I've also heard rumors that the fishing boats have had trouble with storms, so we might need to refit the docks. But first, I'd like to travel there myself to speak with the people in person. When Arya and I go south, I'll see to it that the castle's defenses are brought up to standard." Ser Howell beamed, clearly relieved that Gendry had a sense of direction. "Certainly, my lord. I can compile the relevant figures for you. If you'd like, we can have them ready before your departure." Gendry nodded. "Good," he said simply. Arya sensed the man's eagerness and recognized how odd it must be for Gendry. He was not yet comfortable with the flowery flattery or the immediate acceptance lords typically commanded. She stepped in, her voice cutting in quietly but firmly. "Will you be joining us in the Solar at midday, Ser Howell?" "Yes, my lady. I intend to present the concerns and possibilities for the Stormlands to Lady Sansa as well." Arya inclined her head. "Then we'll speak further then." They parted ways and Arya let out a breath. Gendry raked a hand through his hair. "It's going to be like this every day, isn't it?" "Perhaps," she said with a rueful smile. "But at least we'll be together in it. And soon we'll head south. Maybe we can breathe easier once we leave behind all this bustle. Storm's End is large, but I doubt the lords there will be quite as numerous as the guests packed into Winterfell for the wedding." He grunted in agreement, though a flicker of nerve still danced across his face. "I hope I'll do right by them, by you, by all of this," he murmured. Arya put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Come on. Let's endure that midday meal in the Solar. Then we can slip away again." They proceeded into the keep to prepare, parting briefly so Arya could exchange her simple doublet for something less travel-worn. Sansa insisted on it, of course, an event with so many lords demanded a certain decorum. Arya obliged, though she chose a gown free of excessive embroidery, a straightforward gray with a belt that didn't restrict her movement too much. She still wore her boots beneath, and she strapped a small dagger to her leg, hidden from view. Some habits were impossible to break. When midday arrived, they joined Sansa and Bran in the Solar, a bright room with tall windows that overlooked the courtyard. The wind outside carried the faint scent of pine from the surrounding forests. The gathered party of Northern and Storm landlords formed a wide circle around the table. Gendry took a seat by Arya, wearing a solemn expression. Sansa presided at the head, flanked by Maester Wolkan on one side and the Master-at-Arms on the other. What followed was a careful waltz of courtesies. The Stormlanders rose one by one, introducing themselves with flourishes of "my lord," "my lady," praising the wedding and offering blessings. The Northern bannermen, equally formal, welcomed them and expressed hope for a long alliance. Bran remained quiet through most of it, occasionally giving a small nod or a cryptic smile. Arya wondered sometimes what her brother, the three-eyed raven, truly thought of these political dances. Gendry did his best to respond with politeness, fumbling only a little. Arya noticed a few shared glances among the lords as if they found his straightforward manner refreshing, certainly easier to trust than someone overly polished. She felt a flicker of pride in him. The more he spoke, the steadier his voice grew, the hammer of his old blacksmith life forging a new skill, leadership. At one point, Lord Serwyn, an elderly northern lord whose white hair framed a face lined with age, cleared his throat and addressed Arya directly. "My lady, we have heard many tales of your travels, of your skill with a blade. How do you intend to adapt as wife to Lord Gendry? Will you still ride into the field if need arises?" Arya felt the weight of all eyes upon her. She lifted her chin. "If there's need, yes," she said simply. "I'm no stranger to defending my home. And Storm's End will be my home as well. The storms of the sea don't frighten me, nor does open conflict. I'll stand with my husband if the time comes." Her words carried a firmness that brokered no argument. Lord Serwyn nodded, satisfied or at least placated. She felt Gendry's hand briefly brush against hers under the table, a subtle sign of thanks. Sansa took over the conversation, discussing trade routes with the Stormlands, mainly the export of wool and timber from the north in exchange for the citrus and fish from the southern coast. Maester Wolkan chimed in with logistics, mindful of how harsh winters could disrupt shipping. Arya let the details wash over her, glancing occasionally at Gendry to see how he followed along. He seemed intent if somewhat overwhelmed. The meal concluded without major conflict. Sansa rose, thanking everyone for their time. In the coming days, she said, Gendry and Arya will prepare to travel south. We will keep open lines of communication regarding any northern supplies or levies that might be needed to help the Stormlands rebuild. In time, we hope this bond between our houses will foster mutual prosperity. Polite applause and murmurs of agreement followed. Arya was the first to slip out of the solar once the formalities ended. Gendry caught up to her in the corridor. You vanished like a ghost, he teased. She shrugged. I was near stifling in there. Why do lords always insist on taking so long to say so little? He smiled wryly. At least some of them made real suggestions about trade. We'll need their help if the Stormlands are short on supplies. She nodded, glancing out a narrow window at the snow-laden courtyard. True. I suppose it's not all hot air. He followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. Arya, are you ready to leave Winterfell? She paused, a tightening in her chest. Winterfell was in her bones, the thick walls, the ancient godwood, the crypts where her ancestors lay. She had yearned for this place during her hardest days, reciting the names of her family as a talisman against despair. The idea of leaving it again felt almost traitorous, but at the same time she was not the sort of person to remain still indefinitely. Part of her craved exploration. I'll always miss it, she said softly. But I've never been one to sit in one place, have I? And the Stormlands might be interesting. Besides, it's not as if I'm exiled. I can return whenever I want. Sansa is Lady of Winterfell and Bran is here as well. Our family holds this castle. Gendry reached for her hand, a small gesture of comfort. I've seen storms end only once and I barely remember it. I was too young to realize what it was. But from what I hear, it's an impressive fortress perched over the sea, battered by storms. We'll have to see it together. Arya lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. Yes, she said. We will. And if I dislike it, maybe I'll just sail off for a bit and see what else the world holds. He chuckled. I'd half expect you to. That night, they supped in quieter company. The great hall was less crowded now. Many lords who had come solely for the wedding feast were preparing to depart. Arya found herself unexpectedly nostalgic for that first night's revelry. At least there had been an air of unguarded celebration. Now, everything felt focused on the tasks ahead. Sansa sat with them briefly, discussing details for the journey south. The roads are clear enough for travel, she said. But if you want to make good time, you might consider sailing from White Harbor. The route by sea would take you to the Stormlands more quickly, assuming the seas are calm. Arya grimaced a little. I've sailed before. It's not my favorite, but it's faster. Gendry. He leaned back in his chair, considering. If time is of the essence, sailing might be best. The men we take with us should be prepared for a sea journey. We'll need to ensure we have enough provisions on the ships. Sansa nodded. I'll send ravens ahead to White Harbor. Lord Manderley can see that you're properly supplied for the voyage. Once you arrive at Storm's End, Gendry, you can officially take command. The local steward will present the account books, keys, and such. You'll have to declare a few of your men as officers or overseers. And Arya, there will be a place for you at his side. You'll likely receive local visitors from the keep's vassals. Arya gave a small exhale. Let them come, she said, a hint of impatience in her voice. But don't expect me to bow and scrape. Sansa smiled mildly. I doubt anyone expects that from you, little sister. Arya felt Gendry's hand on her knee beneath the table, a quiet reassurance. She resisted the urge to snort in amusement at the strangely domestic comfort of it. Who would have thought she'd become part of a household in this way? The decision was made. They would depart in 3 days' time, traveling first by horse to White Harbor, then by ship to Storm's End. The next days passed in a blur of farewells and arrangements. Arya took one final walk in the godwood, standing before the heart tree with its carved face. She thought of her father, of all those who had fallen to bring the realm to this moment. She prayed, in her own way, for the strength to keep moving, to honor the Stark name even in the distant Stormlands. She spent her last night in Winterfell's practice yard, clashing wooden swords with one of the younger guards who had boasted he could best her. She defeated him twice in quick succession, and by the time Gendry arrived to watch, she was laughing at the guard's sputtering. Gendry only shook his head in amusement, arms crossed, clearly proud yet unsurprised. When the day of departure came, the sky dawned clear and bright, an unexpected gift. With Sansa, Bran, and a small retinue gathered in the courtyard to see them off, Arya and Gendry mounted their horses. Their saddlebags were packed for a few days' ride to White Harbor, accompanied by a dozen guards, some from the north, some from the Stormlands. The rest of Gendry's men had already headed south, traveling with supply carts or planning to meet him at White Harbor. Sansa stood at Arya's stirrup. "Write to me," she said, "and come back for a visit. Winterfell will always be your home." Arya leaned down to grasp her sister's hand. "I know," she said softly, her eyes flicking to Bran, who sat in his wheeled chair nearby. He offered a small, inscrutable smile. Then, in a more private tone, Sansa murmured, "I'm proud of you, Arya." Arya felt something catch in her throat. She nodded wordlessly, letting go of Sansa's hand. Then she and Gendry set off through the gate, riding under the portcullis. The hoofbeats against the wooden drawbridge echoed in her ears like the drum of her own pulse. She glanced back once, saw Sansa's slender figure outlined against the gray stone, and then Winterfell receded behind them. Their journey southward to White Harbor was peaceful, the roads flanked by snow-covered fields that gradually gave way to patchy farmland. Villages dotted the landscape, smoke curling from chimneys. Word of their passage seemed to have traveled ahead, for on a few occasions, small folk gathered by the roadside to watch. Some cheered or waved respectfully, curious about the unusual couple. Arya tried to hide her discomfort at the attention, nodding politely in return. Gendry did his best to remain stoic, though Arya could sense his unease at being hailed as "my lord" wherever they went. After a few days on horseback, the glitter of the sea appeared on the horizon as they approached White Harbor. The harbor city was bustling with activity. Ships in the port, merchants hawking goods, the scent of fish and salt in the air. Lord Wyman Manderley himself greeted them at the gates of Newcastle. He was a broad man, older, with a booming laugh that made the walls almost tremble. He had known the Starks for years and welcomed Arya and Gendry with open arms, offering them a lavish meal that same evening and promising to provide ships for their journey. Arya found the meal in Newcastle less stifling than she'd feared. Lord Manderley was a jovial host, more intent on stuffing them with seafood pies and ale than on formalities. He praised the new alliance between House Stark and House Baratheon, jesting that perhaps the next generation would produce children who inherited both the wolf's ferocity and the stag's stubbornness. Arya nearly choked on her drink at the mention of children, but Gendry only turned an interesting shade of pink, managing a polite laugh. They boarded 2 sturdy galleys bound for the Stormlands the next morning. The sea journey began smoothly enough, though Arya felt her stomach protest the relentless rocking of the waves. She spent much of the first day standing by the prow, letting the wind whip her face, trying to steady herself. Gendry joined her when he could, though his duties as the nominal leader of the expedition forced him to speak with the captain, check the cargo, and ensure all were prepared if a storm arose. Their second night at sea, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The sailors grew tense, reefing the sails, securing loose cargo, warning everyone to brace themselves. Arya's stomach churned with more than just seasickness as the ship began to pitch and roll. Gendry helped tie down supplies, roping barrels to the deck. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning split the sky in jagged forks. As the storm reached them, rain fell in sheets that hammered the deck. Waves rose, slamming into the hull with ominous force. Arya clung to a rope with one hand while shouting orders to the men struggling to keep the mainsail under control. The wind roared like a beast. She felt her cloak become soaked within moments, her hair plastered to her face. Salt spray stung her eyes, but she refused to retreat below decks. She spotted Gendry across the deck, hauling on a line. A wave crashed over the side, nearly sweeping one of the sailors away. Gendry lunged, grabbing the man's arm and dragging him back before he could be tossed overboard. Arya's heart pounded as she fought for balance, the deck lurching underfoot. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the fierce concentration on Gendry's face. For an instant, she thought how fitting it was that he, forged in adversity, was now battling the very storms that gave his house its name. Hours passed in a blur of relentless battering. The ship creaked and groaned, but the captain and crew were skilled. By dawn, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the decks awash in rainwater, battered sails, and exhausted men. Arya slumped against a barrel, wiping her face with a shaking hand. Gendry stumbled over, equally drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead. He gave her a weary grin. "Well," she rasped, coughing sea spray from her throat, "that was something." He let out a tired laugh, leaning forward to rest his forehead against hers for a moment. Their world smelled of salt and sweat, and the sky had lightened to a bruised gray. "Welcome to the Stormlands," he murmured. They lost half a day's travel due to the storm, but the damaged sails were repaired quickly and the rest of the journey passed with calmer seas. Finally, one late afternoon, the lookout shouted that Storm's End was in sight. Arya went to the railing, straining to see. On a rocky promontory high above the crashing waves stood a massive fortress of pale stone. The walls were thick and unadorned, designed to withstand the savage storms that battered the cape. Arya could see the jagged coastline below, where waves heaved themselves against the rocks in endless fury. They docked at a small port near the base of a cliff where a winding road led up to the castle gates. Despite the hour, a contingent of Stormlander knights waited to escort them. Gendry disembarked first, stepping onto the wooden pier with an air of anticipation. Arya followed, her boots squelching on the damp planks. The man at the head of the knights, clad in a deep blue cloak, bowed low. "My lord," he said, "I am Ser Byron, steward of Storm's End. We have prepared your quarters and stand ready to serve. Your arrival is most welcome." Gendry nodded, once again trying to assume the role expected of him. "Thank you, Ser Byron," he said. "This is my lady, Arya Stark, Baratheon, by marriage," he added after a beat. "We're eager to see the castle." They mounted the waiting horses for the climb. The ascent took them along a steep, winding path carved from the cliffside. The wind assaulted them, though it was only a fraction of the fury they'd endured at sea. Arya peered up at the battlements of Storm's End, impressed by how the walls seemed to merge with the very stone of the cape. Built by the might of the Storm Kings in ancient times, the castle had a certain stark grandeur that reminded her of Winterfell's purposeful design. They passed under the gatehouse and entered a large courtyard. Servants rushed forward, bowing to their new lord and lady. Arya surveyed the keep: tall towers, thick walls, windows shuttered against the ever-present winds. The courtyard itself was paved with flat stones, some stained by centuries of weather. A faint tang of salt hung in the air. Inside, Ser Byron guided them through a broad entry hall, then into a great hall with high, vaulted ceilings. It was lit by long rows of torches, and the walls bore the stag sigil of House Baratheon. At the far end, an imposing hearth crackled with warmth that Arya immediately gravitated toward, grateful to banish the lingering chill of sea spray. A handful of local knights and officials stood by, eager for introductions. They announced Gendry's rightful claim as Lord of Storm's End, reading a royal decree that legitimized him as Robert Baratheon's heir. Arya listened to the formalities in silence, her gaze wandering across the gathered crowd. Men in polished mail and cloaks of deep blue or black, local lords who managed the farmland and fishing villages nearby, and a smattering of older servants who stared at Gendry with a reverence they had once reserved for King Robert's memory. When the introductions ended, Gendry cleared his throat. "I thank you for your welcome," he said. "Storm's End is new to me. I'll do my best to bring prosperity, repair what needs repairing, and stand by my bannermen. But first, I'd like to familiarize myself with the castle and speak to the steward about the state of affairs. If you have concerns, I'll hear them. My wife and I are here to ensure that House Baratheon stands strong." Arya noted the flicker in people's eyes at the mention of my wife. They looked at her with mingled curiosity and respect. She was certainly no docile lady, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a Stark. A few knights bowed their heads, welcoming her as Lady Arya of House Baratheon. Ser Byron spoke up. "We have prepared the Lord's Solar. It's smaller than what you might find in King's Landing, but it has a commanding view of the sea. If you'll follow me, we can review the ledgers, supplies, finances, the condition of the defenses, and so on." Gendry nodded, then turned to Arya with an uncertain glance. "Will you come too?" She considered for a moment, then shook her head. "I'll join you soon," she said, keeping her tone light. "First, I want to take a look around. I've been in a saddle and on a ship for days. I need to walk, get my bearings. If you need me, send someone." He seemed relieved to let her do as she wished. "All right," he said softly. She left him to the steward's ministrations and slipped from the hall. The corridors of Storm's End felt narrower than those of Winterfell, built in a circular design following the curve of the outer walls. Tapestries depicting stags in battle or storms raging at sea adorned the walls here and there. She passed a few servants who bowed quickly, calling her "my lady." She still wasn't used to the title, but she nodded in acknowledgement. Eventually, she found a door leading out onto a battlement walk. The wind buffeted her at once, but she welcomed the fresh salt air. From this vantage, she could see the vast stretch of the sea, gray-green waves capped with foam, all the way to the horizon. The castle's walls dropped sheer to the rocks below, where the water crashed in a ceaseless roar. She took it in, heart pounding at the sheer magnificence of the view. Winterfell was a place of forests and snow, while here the entire world seemed in motion, shaped by the fury of wind and ocean. A voice from behind startled her. "It's beautiful and intimidating, is it not, my lady?" She turned to see a young woman, perhaps a year or two older than Arya, wrapped in a thick cloak. Her hair was dark, braided back. She carried herself with a polite composure. Arya guessed she might be of some minor noble family sworn to Storm's End. "Yes," Arya said simply, turning back to gaze at the sea. "I've never seen anything quite like it." "My name is Lady Eleanor Swan," the woman said, offering a slight curtsy. "My father holds lands a bit further along the coast. I came to greet Lord Gendry, but I also wish to meet you. I've heard stories of Arya Stark." Arya tried not to grimace at the mention of stories. "I hope they weren't too outlandish." Lady Eleanor's eyes were bright with curiosity. "They say you're a skilled sword hand, that you traveled across the narrow sea and beyond, that you survived many trials when most highborn ladies would have perished." She spoke without mockery, merely interest. "I admire that." Arya studied her, wondering if she was genuine. In King's Landing, such words might be laced with condescension, but Eleanor's tone sounded honest. "Thank you," Arya said, shifting her stance so the wind didn't whip her hair into her face. "And I suppose you're here to see how Gendry will run things. How your father's lands might be affected." Eleanor inclined her head. "That's part of it. But I'm also curious how Baratheon has been. Well, it has endured many changes. Seeing you step into that role might inspire others. Storm's End could use a lord and lady who understand how to protect what's theirs." Arya glanced again at the sea. "He'll do fine," she said, believing it. "He's straightforward and honest, and he cares about people more than he admits." Eleanor studied Arya's face. "And you, my lady? Will you be content here?" Arya's lips curved in a small, wry smile. "Content isn't a word I'd use for myself, but I'll make do. There's a certain freedom in these winds. I might like it more than I expected." Eleanor returned the smile, a flicker of relief in her eyes. "Then perhaps we'll see you out on the battlements often, or riding along the coast. Some of us occasionally venture onto the cliffs for hawking, though it can be dangerous." "Dangerous?" Arya repeated, a spark of interest kindling. "I might enjoy that." "Thank you, Lady Eleanor." They exchanged a few more words, after which Eleanor excused herself, saying she would speak with Gendry and the steward about her father's concerns. Arya remained on the battlements, letting the wind tear at her cloak. She could almost feel the place testing her, as if Storm's End itself demanded a certain resilience from anyone who dared to call it home. When she finally returned inside, she wandered until she found the Lord Solar pushing open the heavy door. Gendry was seated at a broad wooden table, Ser Byron and a few other officials standing around. Stacks of parchment cluttered the surface, along with maps and ledgers. A fire roared in a nearby hearth, vainly attempting to chase away the damp chill that seeped through the stone walls. Gendry looked up, relief flashing across his features at the sight of her. "Arya," he said, gesturing for her to join them. "We were just discussing the repairs needed. The last major work done here was during Lord Renly's short-lived time. Some sections of the outer curtain wall need reinforcement, and the armory's roof leaks. Ser Byron also believes we should rebuild the stables." Arya slipped around the table, eyeing the documents. She spotted line after line of expenses, notes on missing roof tiles, rotted timber, accounts of the small folks' harvest yields. Her eyes glazed a bit. This was Sansa's realm of expertise. "That sounds important," she said, focusing on Gendry rather than the pages. He exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "It is. I'll have the men get to work on it immediately. I'd also like to inspect the defensive towers personally. If another big storm blows in, I don't want any part of the castle to cave." Ser Byron nodded. "We can arrange that inspection tomorrow, my lord. For now, might I suggest you settle in? You've had a long journey." Gendry glanced at Arya as if to gauge her thoughts. She took his hand, giving it a small squeeze. "You've done enough for one day," she said quietly. "We can get lost in these ledgers tomorrow." He seemed to hesitate, torn between duty and exhaustion. But then he nodded. "Very well," he told Ser Byron. "I trust you'll keep these matters safe until the morning." The steward bowed. "Of course, my lord. A chamber has been prepared for you and your lady in the Western Tower. I trust you'll find it to your liking." With that, they closed the meeting. Gendry and Arya walked through the winding passages to the Western Tower. A pair of servants accompanied them to carry their belongings, and when they reached the chamber, those servants lit fresh candles and set out a simple supper of bread, cheese, and salted fish. The room itself was warm from a crackling fire. Arya tossed her cloak onto a chair, glancing around at the heavy wooden furniture, the thick tapestries that tried to ward off the damp chill. Gendry sank into a seat, rubbing at his neck. "I haven't had a moment to breathe since we arrived." Arya sat across from him, pulling off her gloves. "You'll need time to adjust. Ruling is new to you, and to me, I suppose." He looked at her, exhaustion and gratitude warring in his expression. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "Storm's End feels daunting, but with you around, I don't feel quite so overwhelmed." She reached across the small table, took his hand. His palm was calloused, reminding her of the old days. "You're not alone in this. Never were." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. When Gendry called for the visitor to enter, in walked Ser Byron once more, head bowed. "Pardon me, my lord, my lady. I forgot to mention, tomorrow night, the local lords wish to host a small feast in your honor. Nothing grand, but they hoped it would welcome you properly." Arya fought a sigh. Another feast. But Gendry didn't protest. "We'll attend," he said. "Thank you, Ser Byron." The steward left them, and Arya breathed out through her nose. "I hope they won't bury us under banquets." Gendry gave a tired smile. "We'll endure it. After that, perhaps we can slip away. I'd like to see the coastline, talk to the fishermen about what they need. You might like it, there's a cove not far from here, so I'm told, where the tide pools are full of strange creatures." Arya found herself intrigued. "We could take horses, make a day of it." She paused, adding in a softer voice, "It's strange, but I'm already beginning to see why this place matters to you, even if you didn't grow up here." He laced his fingers with hers across the table. "We'll make it ours," he said simply. That night, the wind howled outside their tower chamber, battering the thick walls. Arya lay awake for a time, listening to the roar. It was different from the quiet hush of snow in Winterfell, but it held its own power. Gendry slept beside her, his breathing steady. She turned onto her side, watching the flicker of the dying firelight dance across his face, thinking about the improbable path that had led them here. For the next several days, they immersed themselves in Storm's End. Arya insisted on exploring the battlements and the courtyards on foot. She practiced archery with a small group of soldiers, demonstrating a keen eye that made a few men gawk. Meanwhile, Gendry walked through the armory, the stables, the storage rooms, leaving notes on what repairs were needed. He learned the names of key villagers and local leaders, understanding how the harvest had fared and what might be done to help them through lean times. The small feast with the local lords passed without incident. The talk mostly centered on the memory of Robert Baratheon. Some older men recalled him as a roaring, jovial presence who could outrank an entire garrison. Others had stories of Renly's charming court. A few ventured to mention Stannis, but that name usually drew uneasy silence. Through it all, Gendry listened attentively, offering only what was needed, while Arya observed from the high table, noting alliances and hidden grudges among the lesser lords. Storm's End grew more familiar each day. Arya found places to spar, an abandoned courtyard behind the stables, for instance, and she even discovered a small library in an old turret that seemed neglected. One afternoon, she ventured there to find Gendry already seated at a desk, scribbling notes. He glanced up when she entered, giving her a rueful look. "Ser Byron insists I need to understand the lineage of the Stormlands. It's enough to make my head spin." Arya laughed, moving around the room. Dust motes floated in the sunbeams that streamed through a high window. The shelves sagged with old tomes, half of which looked as though they hadn't been opened in decades. "Sounds dull," she admitted, trailing a finger along a row of books. "But maybe it'll help you know who's who." He sighed. "That's the idea." She set a hand on his shoulder, leaning over to glance at his notes. Names of ancient Storm Kings, alliances with Dorne and the Reach, even references to Targaryen invasions. She recognized some from old lessons in Winterfell, but most bored her to tears. Still, she admired his commitment. Despite the daily work, they found time to be alone. Some evenings, after the castle's bustle died down, they would walk the ramparts or sit by the hearth in their chamber, talking softly about the future. Arya teased Gendry about forging a new sword for her, something that might withstand the salt air. He promised to do so when the forge was fully repaired. One morning, a messenger arrived bearing word that trouble lurked on the Stormlands borders. A band of outlaws had been raiding caravans traveling between Storm's End and the nearby farmland. The local folk were frightened and a few had been wounded in the skirmishes. Gendry wasted no time. He rallied a small group of guards, informing them they would ride out to investigate. Ser Byron proposed sending a knight in Gendry's stead, but Gendry refused, insisting on seeing the threat himself. Arya was at his side as they mounted their horses in the courtyard. The sky threatened rain as ever, but they were undeterred. She noticed a few Stormlander knights exchanging glances at the sight of Lady Arya riding out armed, but none dared question her. Gendry gave the order, and they set off at a canter, hooves drumming against the coastal road. They traveled for half a day, passing through small villages crouched behind wind-bent trees. At last, they reached the spot where the raids had reportedly taken place, a lonely stretch of road flanked by marshy ground and low, scraggly brush. Gendry called a halt, scanning the area. Arya dismounted, bending to examine the tracks. "Fresh hoofprints," she murmured. "At least half a dozen riders. They might be close." The wind carried the faintest scent of brine. Gendry signaled for the group to spread out, arching the area carefully. The sky darkened with a coming squall, thunder rumbling distantly. They scoured the trail until Arya spotted a faint wisp of smoke rising from behind a ridge. She motioned to Gendry, who nodded, instructing the men to approach quietly. They crept up the ridge. Beyond it lay a small hollow screened by twisted pines. A cluster of ragged men and horses milled about a sputtering campfire. Arya counted at least 7, possibly more, lurking among the trees. She saw stolen goods piled near the fire, sacks of grain, bits of cloth, and scattered coin. One of the men wore a battered breastplate that might have once belonged to a Stormlander guard. Gendry motioned for his men to circle, and in a low voice, he called for the outlaws to surrender. The bandits reacted instantly, snatching up weapons, a rusted sword, a pike, a couple of short bows. Fear flashed in their eyes, but desperation too. One of them loosed an arrow that whistled past a knight's helm. Chaos erupted. Arya drew her blade, a short sword she'd taken to carrying. She rushed down the slope, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to catch the outlaws off guard. One lunged at her, swinging a crude axe. She sidestepped easily, slashing across the man's arm. He dropped the axe with a shriek, clutching his wound. Another bandit tried to grab her from behind, but she twisted free and drove her elbow into his gut. He doubled over, and she struck him across the back of the head with the pommel of her sword. Gendry, astride his horse, shouted for the outlaws to lay down their arms. 2 men tried to flee, but knights intercepted them, wrestling them to the ground. An arrow grazed Gendry's shoulder, tearing the fabric of his cloak but not piercing deeply. He let out a grunt of pain but kept his seat, guiding his horse around to block the remaining bandit. The man, panic in his eyes, swung a pike. Gendry parried it with a shield, then smacked the bandit's chest with the shield's iron rim. The man toppled, winded. At that point, the last outlaw lost all will to fight. He threw down his sword and raised his hands in surrender. Panting, Arya checked Gendry's wound. The arrow had left a shallow groove, but no worse. She pressed a hand to the tear in his cloak. "You're lucky," she murmured. "Another inch and you could have been skewered." He offered a lopsided grin, adrenaline still coursing through him. "I've survived worse." They disarmed the outlaws, rounding them up. They found a handful of villagers' belongings, a hard evidence that these men had been terrorizing the countryside. One of the knights recognized a stolen signet ring from a local merchant who had been attacked. Gendry's expression hardened. He turned to the ragged leader of the bandits, who was bleeding from a cut on his forearm. "You've attacked innocent folk. Killed a few if the stories are true. You'll face justice at Storm's End." The man spat, but fear tightened his features. "We've no land, no coin. War left us with nothing. You're not Robert Baratheon. Who are you to judge us?" Gendry's knuckles went white around his reins. For a moment, Arya worried he would lose his temper. But he took a breath, controlling himself. "I'm Gendry Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End," he said, voice low and steady. "And you made your choice when you turned to murder and theft. Now you'll face the consequences." The knights bound the outlaws, intending to bring them back for trial. Arya watched as Gendry supervised the men collecting the stolen goods. Despite the bandit leader's sneer, she saw a flicker of resolve in Gendry's face. He was not Robert, nor Renly, nor Stannis, but he was Baratheon in his own right, determined, protective of those under his care. She felt an odd swell of pride. As they returned to Storm's End with the prisoners in tow, the sky opened in a light drizzle. The men trudged on foot, miserable but subdued. Gendry rode at the head of the column, muddy and tired, but unbowed. Arya kept pace beside him, droplets of rain glistening in her hair. She could sense that this had solidified something in his mind, a new facet of leadership. It was one thing to talk about ruling in the safety of a hall. It was another to ride out, confront brutality, and protect the people. Back at the castle, the outlaws were taken to the dungeons to await trial. Word quickly spread that Lord Baratheon himself had ridden out to bring them in. The small folk whispered that he was proving to be a force, much like the old days when House Baratheon meant more than just a name in King's Landing. Arya saw new respect in the servants' eyes as she passed. They had heard of her swordplay, of how she stood beside her husband to face danger. That evening, in the privacy of their chamber, Gendry sank into a chair by the hearth, his shoulder bandaged. Arya was busy wringing water from her cloak. She glanced over at him, noticing his weary posture. "That was a lot for one day," she said softly. He nodded. "Aye, but it had to be done. People need to know we're not letting them fend for themselves. We'll hold trial for those men soon. Perhaps some can be sent to the Night's Watch, if they prefer that to execution. Others might have to face stricter punishment, especially if they've killed." Arya placed her cloak near the fire to dry and crouched beside him, resting a hand on his knee. "You're doing what a lord must." He met her gaze. "I suppose so. Still feels strange, though. Passing judgment on anyone." She leaned closer, her eyes steady. "You have a good heart. That's all you need, truly. The rest you can learn." He exhaled, a trembling breath. "Thank you." She rose then, slipped onto his lap, and draped her arms around his shoulders, mindful of his bandage. He hesitated only a moment before folding her against him, seeking warmth in her closeness. The fire crackled, and the storm outside rattled the shutters, but Arya felt secure in that small sphere of flickering light. In the days that followed, Storm's End slowly adjusted to its new lord and lady. Gendry oversaw repairs, consulted with local leaders, and made decisions that set the region on a firmer footing. Arya played her part. Some days that meant listening to petitions in the Great Hall, standing with Gendry as they settled disputes. On others, it meant practicing archery with the guards or riding into the countryside to ensure the roads were safe. She was no conventional lady, but her presence commanded respect. Stories spread about how she had helped capture the bandits, how she carried a blade and knew how to use it. Messages arrived from Winterfell. Sansa wrote to say that the harvest in the north was adequate, and she asked how Storm's End fared. Arya wrote back with a blunt summary, adding a few personal lines about the storm that nearly sank their ship, how the wind kept her awake at night, but how Gendry was settling in well. She ended by promising to visit as soon as they could. Some weeks later, the castle's repairs were well underway, and the local folk seemed heartened by the more active leadership. One evening, Arya and Gendry walked along the battlements together, watching the last rays of the sun bleed into the horizon. The sea glimmered darkly, the wind carrying the brine. She leaned into him, letting his warmth steady her against the gusts. "It's not so bad here," she said after a while, voice raised to be heard over the wind. "Though I miss the quiet hush of the snow sometimes." He brushed a hand over her hair. "You'll see it again," he assured her. "We'll visit when the roads allow. But for now, Storm's End needs us." Arya nodded. For all her restlessness, she felt something solid forming in her chest, a sense of belonging. Maybe not the same belonging as Winterfell's ancient stones, but a new shape to her life. She had never expected to marry, never expected to hold any sort of title. Yet here she was, forging a path with someone who understood her wanderer's heart. She recalled the day they said their vows in Winterfell, with the biting northern wind swirling around them. Now, as another wind swept her hair across her face, she smiled. This was theirs, this battered fortress perched above the raging sea, this alliance that no one had foreseen, the forging of Stark and Baratheon into something new. Perhaps the storms would always rage, but she had grown used to the howling of the wind, and she was not afraid. Gendry turned her gently toward him, the sun's last light casting gold across his features. She lifted her face, and he kissed her, a steady, unhurried warmth against the distant roar of waves. In that moment, She remembered every challenge, every uncertain step, every promise whispered in the dark. Yet there they stood, united. The future stretched out like an uncharted road, full of hidden perils and wonders. But Arya Stark, now Baratheon by name, had never shied away from the unknown. Together, they would weather whatever storms came next.